Hi there, this is Ronnie, coming at you with a video. Bit of a rant, but bear with me folks. I saw a video earlier, and the video was giving some very good general advice about RPGs. Not from the point of view of how to be a better player in a game so much, but how to be a better player at a game. And for the most part it was pretty much common sense stuff, but it's still good every now and again for people to, get that information. And that was fair enough. But I commented that the thing that I was a little saddened by was, and he even mentions it up front in the video, that he called it how to be a better Dungeons and Dragons player. Even though, as I say, by his own admission, all of this was for general role-playing games. And I basically commented, and I was a little saddened that he was just saying Dungeons and Dragons when he just should have said role-playing games. That whilst Dungeons and Dragons is the most well-known game in town, it's not the only game in town. It's not even the only fantasy game in town. And if you're going to do something that's generically that's good advice for all RPGs, call it role-playing games. Because there will be people, a lot of people, who don't play Dungeons and Dragons, or very rarely play Dungeons and Dragons, which is the case with me, who may not watch his video. His reply was sad to me. That I think he's a full-time YouTuber now, and as such he felt he had to consider his demographic, and if he had put role-playing games up in the title, it wouldn't have gotten the same hit as saying Dungeons and Dragons in the title. I found that very sad. And the reason I found it sad is because whilst I understand completely that Dungeons and Dragons is the most well known by some distance, as long as people are constantly only referring to D&D, a lot of other games aren't going to be well known. So it's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If all we talk about is D&D, then all that's going to be heard about is D&D. And my thing is, do we want one role-playing game to define the whole hobby? I don't. Which is why I don't like any one game being used as an interchangeable term with the hobby. I don't want Warhammer to be an interchangeable term with wargaming. I don't, as much as I love the Star Wars films, I don't want Star Wars to be seen as an interchangeable term with science fiction, because there's a lot more out there than just Star Wars. And yes, I'm aware that Star Wars is technically science fantasy, but it kind of gets shoved in there. I don't want fantasy to be an interchangeable term with Lord of the Rings, because if we do that, then we end up forgetting about things like Game of Thrones. And the opposite is also true. I don't want fantasy to be defined by Game of Thrones, so that we lose something like Lord of the Rings. The reason we have these catchment terms when we're talking about a whole genre or a whole hobby rather than one specific part is we're talking about so many different sides and views and ideas and genre when it comes to role-playing games as a hobby. Fantasy, whilst it is undoubtedly the biggie, is not the only genre out there. So I find it sad. I continue to say RPG or role-playing games. I will talk about a specific, I will name a specific system in a conversation, either because I'm reviewing or talking about that particular system in itself, or I'm using that system, that game, as an example of what I'm talking about. But to use an example, my favourite genre is pretty much steampunk. I like horror as well, but steampunk. My game of choice for steampunk is Castle Falkenstein, as anyone knows. But I don't refer to steampunk as Castle Falkenstein. I refer to steampunk as steampunk. Castle Falkenstein is merely one example, one game in that category. And that's the way it should be. If all we're going to do is say one game, because it happens to be well known, to the dismissal of all others, for just because people have only heard of that game, we're defeating the point. If we want people to hear about the other games more, we need to tell them other games exist. And whilst I understand hits and demographics, I think it's sad that something that has a more general purpose video has been labelled as being quite narrow. Now I'm sure the video will come up on a lot of people's search lists, and I'm sure a lot of people will watch it. The person in general does have a fair few subscribers. He's got one less now. And that was a personal choice. But if you're gonna do a video about Dungeons and Dragons, make it about Dungeons and Dragons. That's fine. If you're going to do a video about fantasy role-playing games, and you're talking in general terms about fantasy role-playing games, but you happen to mention Dungeons and Dragons as an example, fine. But when you're when you're talking about the whole of a hobby, and you label it by one part. Now, as I say, I know how successful role-playing D&D is. It's the most well-known game, but it's one game. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of RPGs out there, and they're never going to get heard if all we do is talk about our whole hobby and label it D&D. It's not D&D. It's role-playing. If I'm playing Castle Falkenstein, I'm not playing Dungeons and Dragons. I'm playing a role-playing game. I'm not playing Dungeons and Dragons. If I'm playing Dragon Age, I'm not playing Dungeons and Dragons. If I'm playing Cult, I'm not playing Dungeons and Dragons. But I am playing role-playing games. That's my thoughts on this, guys. As usual, I'm not running with a script here. I'm just thinking out loud about how I feel. I mean, in one regard, I get it, but I don't agree with it. And I actually feel, personal opinion, I actually feel it is detrimental to our hobby as a whole when our entire hobby is labelled as if one game in that hobby is an interchangeable term. And if you want a good example, try telling someone who's Scottish that England and Britain are interchangeable terms. See how far that gets you. Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games are not interchangeable terms, and they should never be. D&D, big game, well-known game, big kid on the block, not the only kid, not the only game in town. It's that simple. It's role-playing games. That's to the term. That's how it should be. By all means, use D&D as an example if that's a game. Or if you're doing a video about D&D, as I say, if you're doing a video that's labelled as D&D, then you should be talking about D&D. This is a video basically about role-playing games, and as such, D&D won't be in the title.